Okay, you should be set.
Thank you so much, Summer. Welcome everybody to a special City Council meeting. Today is April 6, 2021. Before we get started, I would like to, I do need to read off our written determination. So of the chair of the public body pursuant to House Bill 5002 in Utah Code. Whereas pursuant to Moab Municipal Code, I am the presiding officer at all meetings of the Moab City Council, whereas Utah Code and the Open and Public Meetings Act governs the conduct of meetings of the Moab City Council, whereas the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act amendments provide that a public body may convene and conduct an electronic meeting without an anchor location if the chair of the public body, A, makes a written determination that conducting the meeting with an anchor location presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. And B, states in the written determination described in subsection 4A the facts upon which the determination is based. Whereas in the previous written determinations that I made from August through December 2020 and January and February 2021, I stated the facts regarding COVID-19 and transmission, and I incorporate those prior written determinations here. Whereas the state of Utah remains under a state of public health emergency, Grand County is in a moderate level of transmission, and the City of Moab Council meetings do require attendance by individuals at higher risk of severe illness from COVID-19. And as of February 19, 2021, the CDC still indicates that the lowest risk for meetings is virtual only, whereas the health and safety of council members, city officials, and employees, staff, and members of the public is best served by holding electronic meetings of the council, whereas the council has prepared for and demonstrated the ability to effectively conduct its public meetings electronically, including providing members of the public means to observe the council's meetings and provide comments electronically. Now, therefore, I conclude that conducting Moab City Council meetings with an anchor location that is physically accessible for members of the public to attend in person presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. This determination will expire 30 days after the day upon which I made the determination. It is possible that circumstances could warrant future determinations, and so I may reissue future written determinations at that time, signed by me, although we are coming close to the end here of this virtual Zoom meeting, and I'm very much looking forward to being in person with all of you. Without further ado, we are gathered tonight for a special meeting of the Moab City Council to, oh gosh, I suppose I could pull up the agenda and read that the purpose of their meeting is a presentation of the proposed fiscal year and 2022 budget. With that, I will turn the time over to our city manager, Joel Linares, and our interim finance director, Rachel Stenta, but with a nod of hello and welcome to Ben Billingsley, our newly hired finance director. What a time, baptism by fire. Welcome to our team, Ben, and take it away.
Well, thanks everybody. We're here tonight to start the budget process with council. Rachel, myself, Danny, Carly, Summer, and staff have put in a lot of time getting this ready. Ben started on Monday, so he's just getting brought up to speed on everything and where we're at, and we're lucky to have him and happy to have him. So it's definitely baptism by fire. We have presented you guys a recommendation for budget. This process now entails you guys sitting down with us through this process and changing and making it your budget and what you want it to be as the legislative body. It's your authority to oversee spending and approve all spending. So this process is yours, and we're here to facilitate the final budget as you guys wish to see it in a way that you can support it and approve it. So with that said, I will turn the time over to Rachel, who's prepared a presentation, and I'll let her take it from here.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me okay? I switched over to a headset because we were having an echo issue earlier. Got a
We can
thumbs
hear
up?
you, but it is not the best of the microphone, but We do hear you.
How about now?
Rachel, we could try it without it, and if everyone else is somewhat muted, I don't know if we'll have a problem.
Okay, let me try it without.
It's just the difference between the tunnel voice and the voice, and since we'll get so much voice.
How about now?
That's
Is
good.
that better? Okay, all right, then I will not use the headset. Okay, so welcome. Deja vu, I'm here to present the budget. And I'm very happy to have Ben on board. I had the opportunity to meet Ben again today by Zoom meeting, and very excited to be handing the reins over, as it were, but also helping him to transition over the next couple of months so that he can hit the ground running and have a seamless budget transition. So welcome, as the mayor said, welcome, Ben. And I just want to make sure everyone received the budget twice. This sounds like Danny sent it out and then I sent it out again Sunday night, but it was so good we wanted you to read it twice. So that's why you got 2 copies. Everything that we go through tonight will be kind of a summary level view of the detailed document that you received by email. So along the way, if you have questions, we can stop and go through in more detail, but we're going to cover this year's budget. Let me share my screen actually. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Yes, okay. So we'll go through the proposed budget, the administrative recommendation that you have in front of you. In addition to that, let me actually get into presenter view so you don't have to see, whoops. Well, I guess you'll see the rest of my screen, but that's okay. We're also going to take a look at fiscal year ending 2020 and how that year ended up so that you can see what the net effect since COVID inconveniently spanned fiscal years for the city. Part of it was last fiscal year, part of it was this fiscal year. I thought it would be helpful just to see how fiscal year 2020 wrapped up and what the overall net fiscal impact was for last year as we're looking at the current year we're in, and then the proposed budget. We'll go a little bit deeper into 1 or 2 of the budgets, talk a little bit about revenue, and then just finish up with timeline for the proposed budget that you have in front of you. So with that, I will jump in. I know that I've gone through this every year, but for the council's benefit, staff's benefit, and then also for the public, I thought it might just be helpful to give just a brief overview of all of the funds that we deal with in our budget. General fund is where all of our governmental operations take place. So when we think of things like administration, engineering, building inspection, planning, public safety, most of public works that's not related to water and sewer, all of that's happening in the general fund. Our special revenue funds, which is the Class C road fund, recreation fund, that's probably the one that you hear the most about out of the special revenue funds. The housing fund, which is a relatively new fund, that's where our affordable housing projects happen in Fund 30. And community development fund, which really is where any of the CDBG grant opportunities that we get, any of those projects take place. The debt service fund is also new. We moved all of our debt service payments into one fund so that we could track them separately from other capital projects and make sure that we're reflecting those separate from capital costs since they are long-term debt. Capital project funds, which would be, previously it was known as the Mill Creek Fund, Fund 28, we actually call it the Trail Fund now. And then the Capital Projects Fund, Fund 41, which would be any capital project not associated with a water, sewer, or stormwater project, since those are enterprise funds. The enterprise funds, as we all know, have to be run as a business, meaning that, I apologize, you're going to hear a couple of barks for the next 5 minutes till my babysitter gets home. The enterprise fund has to be run as a business, meaning that the revenue that it generates from user rates has to pay for operations and capital costs. The converse of that is that operations and capital costs have to be paid by user rates. So think of it as a business. We have to be generating enough income to pay for our employees, pay for our supplies, pay for maintenance, pay for capital costs. And then the internal service fund, also new fund for our health insurance fund. We set that up about 2 years ago when we started. Well, actually, we've been self-insured for our employee health insurance, I think for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years now. And we set up the separate fund a couple of years ago so that we could keep track of the savings and ideally in the next year or two, be able to drop some of our reinsurance so that we've collected enough in a safety net fund to be able to cover some of those reinsurance costs ourselves and bring the premium cost as an employer down. So just an overview of funds as we're going through and we're talking about these numbers. Hopefully it'll make a little more sense. And just as an aside, this presentation will be available after tonight. It's up to you if you want to like post a public link on the website so that anybody can pull it up. Obviously, City Council can pull it up. Anything that we go through here in quick detail, you can go back in and look at later. So as in previous years, the departments submit their requests to the city manager. The amount that came in requested this year was $29,751,780. That's across to all funds, all departments, capital projects. That's inclusive of everything that takes place at the city. In order to balance it to zero, once revenue projections were completed, 1.5 million had to be reduced from those department requests. So what you have before you in the document that was emailed out is 28,168,805. And I know in previous years, some council members have said, what's our overall budget? Like, what's the number when we're talking to other cities and they want to know how much our overall budget is? That's the number you're looking for. 28,168,805 is an all-inclusive number of capital projects, debt, operations, everything that it takes to operate as a city. So these functional categories that we have match what you have on your budget report. So for example, when you're in the general fund and you're looking at departments like administrative and executive and engineering, those fall under the general government category. Police is under public safety, streets is under public works. So these are in functional categories just so that we can look as a group instead of drilling down into each individual departments, which some of you wanted like a more summarized version. So this gives you kind of a more condensed version of the budget. So general government, this is intended to show you where the cuts were made to reduce that 1.5 million, blue being the department requested, red being the administrative recommendation. You can see for the most part, none of the cuts were major. In fact, the majority of it came from capital projects. We're going to talk about revenue next, but just to kind of skip ahead a little bit, sales tax was budgeted at a flat rate, meaning a 0% increase. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But in order to do that, or excuse me, in order to keep a 0% increase, capital projects were basically stripped down to the bare bones until we see how revenue starts to come in this next year. If it comes in much greater than we might have predicted, then at your mid-year opening, you'd have the opportunity to go back, reevaluate some of those capital project requests, and then potentially bring those back in your mid-year opening. So capital projects was some low-hanging fruit for balancing the budget to be able to say, you know, operationally, all of the departments put in, I don't want to say slim budgets, but they put in pretty fiscally responsible budgets given the year of COVID that we just closed out of. There weren't a lot of new asks. Everyone kept everything as lean as possible to help keep the budget numbers low. So looking at this graph, you can see there weren't any major cuts with any of the departments. The majority of it came from capital projects. Things like debt payments, they're fixed. We're not able to adjust those at all. So where does our revenue come from? And this is across all funds, so it includes the enterprise fund. And this year, when you see borrowing, there's a couple of things to keep in mind, there's two bonds that the council just had public hearings on. One was for the Walnut Lane Development Project, which is a bond of 6.4 million, which is included here in the budget. The other is the water bond, which is a $7 million bond. It's not included right now on the revenue side, assuming that that is approved prior to the adoption of your budget, then we would want to include that in the council adopted budget. So just to kind of put that out there as a disclaimer. So the way it's configured right now with just the Walnut Lane bond, 6.4 represents project borrowing that would come in for that specific Walnut Lane development project. Taxes being sales-based taxes, which we'll look at in more detail on the next slide, represent $10 million, so 40.3% of overall city revenue. Charges for services, the bulk of that coming from enterprise funds, which would be water and sewer user fees, and recreation and general fund also has some charges for services, including sanitation, which is about 1.2 million. So the total charges for services, just under 30% of the total revenue. Licenses and permits coming in at less than 0.5%. Intergovernmental representing interlocal agreements or cost shares that we have set up with other government entities. And then a very small percentage this year coming from reserves, mainly for carryover projects. So of that $10 million in sales-based taxes, I thought it would be helpful just to kind of show you how those break out. The biggest piece of the pie, of course, is resort community tax. That's really the biggest chunk of our sales-based taxes, coming in at about 4.6 million. Transient room tax, 1.4. Of the local option sales and use, 2.2. The only change, since we budgeted a flat 0% increase, the only change that you will see is the RAP tax, which is newly implemented, and we anticipate a full 12-month collection period next fiscal year, and that's estimated to bring in just under $320,000 in new revenue. And the other thing to keep in mind looking at this particular revenue stream is that the majority of these taxes coming in are generated from the tourism base. Obviously, there is local sales attributed to our local population, the things like resort community, transient room tax, very small, if any, percentage of that would be paid locally at point of sale. Sales and use tax obviously would, but estimates vary anywhere from 60 to 80% of sales-based taxes coming directly from the tourism base.
Hey, Rachel, can you explain also, just because of the way that that sales tax money is dispersed back to us as a city? Just, a two-part question. The first is, will the RAP tax be sent back to us in the same check that the sales tax, all the other sales tax are given to us by the state?
So I'm just sort of conjecturing here, knowing how the state works, but they direct deposit directly into our PTIF account. So I'm sure that distribution of RAP tax will follow that same pattern. And then they send a report showing what that deposit represents. So the collection period and the amount that was collected. So it will still reflect as a separate deposit so that we can easily identify that it's a RAP tax. But the state will collect it. They'll be the point of collection, and then they'll distribute it back to the city.
And so, like, just started collecting August or April, the other month, April 1st. So we've just got a few days, 6 days now of collecting it. But then at the end of April, the state will do their thing for another month, and then so we won't see our first RAP tax dollar until July 1st?
Potentially, if it was collected in April, end of June, beginning of July. Yeah, so.
And then the second part is that as we're looking at fiscal year 21 to 22, when we talk about revenue as of like the first month of our fiscal year, at the end of July, we're talking about May revenue? Do we do it like cash flow or do we do it like?
We're on a cash basis for a revenue, not accrual.
Thank
So
you.
when we receive the money, it's counted in that month.
So that's just an important thing to mention.
Real quickly, the RAP tax is actually collected quarterly. So it started April 1st, it'll go April, May, June, close out June 30, and then we'll probably see the first payment around September would be my guess.
So different than our sales tax revenue.
It'll be, I think Rachel's correct in the fact that it'll be deposited in the same way and follow that procedure. But according to the state law, when we went through all of it, it's collected quarterly.
The estimate should remain the same, however, because we'll just get a larger payment in September. That payment will represent 3 months worth of collections rather than getting a payment every month that represents 30 days.
But we'll show a higher quarterly than we will because we do it as cash instead of accrual.
Right. So the month of September will show a higher payment, and then the month of December will show a higher payment. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
But the overall estimate for the 12 months would stay the same. Okay. So compared to last year for these revenue streams, taxes, again, they were budgeted flat, but the difference between the two that you can see is the implementation of the RAP tax. Licenses and permits, you'll see with both licenses and permits and impact fees, quite a reduction there. As I went through and I did estimates and I compared where we are year to date, because the blue numbers that you're looking at here are budget numbers, not actual, because the year hasn't closed, so I can't give you year-end actual. With both licenses, licenses and permits, which include building permits, specifically commercial building permits, and impact fees, we have a drastic reduction in what we are bringing in, which, talking to Joel, I feel is directly attributed to the elimination of new overnight accommodations. That is where the bulk of our impact fees within city limits and also our commercial building permits come from. So when you look at the reduction in those numbers for next year, that's a reflection of that change in regulation on overnight accommodations. Intergovernmental went up just a little bit. Charges for services increased as well. Part of that is the increase in the water rates that went into effect this last fiscal year. Project borrowing, again, that is just the Walnut Lane project. So assuming that you pass the water bond, that would increase by $7 million. Reserves last year, $1 million was, or excuse me, the current year, $1 million was budgeted to come from reserves. This next year, it's $488,971, and that is actually in the housing fund, and that is for operations of affordable housing. And then miscellaneous decreased this year by about $130,000. So that is the money coming into the city. Now let's look at where the money goes. So again, this breaks it out in those functional categories: general government, public safety, public works. That makes up about half of the pie of our total overall budget. Rec and parks, most places it's parks and rec, but when you lump parks in with recreation, recreation is really the bigger piece. So I just kind of transpose those. Community services, capital projects. Now that includes enterprise funds, since we're looking at the overall city budget. Same with public works. When you're looking at public works here, it includes water, sewer, and storm drainage, in addition to the general fund public works and the Class C fund. And debt payments, 1.4 million, which is a fixed amount. Capital projects, again, could potentially increase by the amount of the water bond that you would spend this next year. The proceeds from borrowing would be 7 million, but I think it's a multi-year project, so you probably wouldn't spend the full 7 million in 1 year. And then just a snapshot of how that looks compared to last year's budget. And again, these are not, or excuse me, the current year budget. It's kind of confusing when we're talking about 20, 21, and 22. So last year being the year that we're currently in, 21 budget in blue, next year 22 in red. So slight increases in those departments. We'll talk about personnel when we get to that slide, but it does include some slight increases in the overall personnel budget, including a cost of living increase of 1.8%, and then reinstituting a couple of the pay incentives that were discontinued or temporarily discontinued during the year of COVID as a cost saving measure. Capital projects, again, you can see the difference that Walnut Lane project is making. If you take the 6.4 million out, you can see what we're left with for the year is about 800,000. And debt payments, we had one debt payment that last year was principal only, and this year, or excuse me, was interest only. This year we picked up the principal. And so that's the main difference in the debt payment there. So now let's talk about fund balances. I know that we've talked about fund balances before, but it might be confusing for members of the public or anyone that's used to how it works in private industry, because government financing is a little bit different. But with each of the funds, they can carry a fund balance. And what a fund balance is, if you're used to accounting in the private sector, it's similar to retained earnings. In the general fund, for example, it's the difference between assets and liabilities, but the easiest way to think about it is revenue over expenditures at the end of the year. So at the end of the year, if you have brought in more in revenue than you have spent in expenditures, that amount will go into your fund balance. The fund balance can have some restrictions, however. If you are carrying debt in that particular fund and you need to have a set aside for your debt payment, in the enterprise fund, for example, where we collect impact fees, those are restricted. Any funds that are restricted either by law, by statute, or by something that the council has set up for a specific use, those are not available to spend. So that would be part of a restricted fund balance. So as we move forward talking about fund balances, I just wanted you to kind of have an idea. I'm going to mute for just a second. I'm sorry.
You know, if it's not kids or puppies, it's got to be something. Probably this is like a commercial break for like, are you tired? Are you tired of Zoom meetings? Well, we have a solution for you. The vaccine. Welcome back, Rachel. No worries.
Thank you. Sorry, it's hard to compete with a squeaky toy. Okay. So looking at the historical use of our fund balance in the general fund, with sales tax coming in at a healthy trend over the last quite a while, but at least the last 10 or 15 years of having increases every year, you can see that we've been able to fund capital projects out of the general fund balance. This goes back to 2010. About every other year, we would make a sizable transfer of our sales tax revenue over expenditures at the end of the year into the capital projects fund. That would allow us to purchase equipment, put cash towards a major capital project. At that point in time, we weren't really taking on new debt, so we weren't using it necessarily for debt payments, but to put cash capital into road projects or facilities or other projects that we were paying for as we went along. Blue is one-time use. Generally, those uses are operations. Generally, that's not a sound fiscal practice, because when you're using your fund balance for operations, that's not sustainable. If you're funding positions or other operational expenses from one-time revenue, from one-time funding, you can't count on that from year to year. So generally, that's not a practice that you want to do unless it's an unusual circumstance. So you can see 2018, 2019, we made some sizable one-time use withdrawals from our fund balance. You may recall this time last year when Joel and I started doing the budget before COVID, it was kind of foreshadowing almost. We stripped the budget down so that we would not be relying on any one-time usage of fund balance. So we went through and cut about $1.5 million from the budget before COVID to make sure that we weren't relying on fund balance money to balance the budget. And then you can see 2020 actually came down to a much healthier level as far as usage of fund balance. So now we are going to talk, actually, let me go back here so you can see we're in last year. So I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of 2020. If you remember the color coding system here of right before I transitioned out, when we were trying to somehow come up with a prediction of what we thought COVID might do, what sort of impact we might feel on sales-based taxes. That was right about the time that we knew we were going to shut down. We didn't know how long we were going to be shut down. And so we were hoping not to be too far into the red. Looking at how sales tax ended up for fiscal year 20, we actually ended up right about there, right about at 13%, which is good. We didn't end up in the red. We were kind of in the mid-orange section. This shows what we had budgeted, the 9.5 in taxes. And at the end of the year, we came in at 8.3 million. So that is reflective of being shut down for, I believe it was the entire month of April. I have to help my memory. I think we opened back up in May, but then we still had some pretty strict social distancing restrictions put in place for restaurants. Hotels, I believe, still had occupancy restrictions in place. So a 13% loss in revenue for a complete shutdown. At the time, didn't feel moderate, but looking back in retrospect, could have been much worse. Charges for services for last year actually had an increase of about 400,000. Licenses and permits, miscellaneous and Class C, you can see how those ended the year. And so overall, when you look at all operational revenue sources combined for last year, which are all of these categories that we just saw on the graph, the overall loss, as it were, due to COVID or due to other mitigating factors that mixed in with COVID, was actually a 4.8% decrease in operational revenues, or about $824,000. So some of those increases in the charges for services helped offset the loss that we experienced in sales-based taxes. And let's take a look, since COVID spanned fiscal years, and we really had April, May, and June in last year, and then we were still feeling some of the impacts starting in July. Just posted April's numbers yesterday, so we're not going to go through it in detail, but the main thing that I want to show you is that even with July, August, and September, which you can see here on resort community, the green bar being this year, we still were down July, August, and September. We've recaptured losses of COVID, and overall our sales-based taxes are up 6%, 3% year to date over the previous year. We're approaching May, which is when we would have received our first payment from the state on sales taxes that would have been impacted by COVID because the shutdown was in March or in April? April.
March. Like, I mean, like it was like what's the actual shutdown when like people when the lodging shut down because the marathon was mid-March, and so
Okay.
that's when we were rolling up the carpet.
So based on May's line here, which you can see is significantly down from 18-19. So once May's figures come in, obviously they're going to be quite a bit higher. Then you'll start to see a significant difference over last year. But if we had to draw a line and say this is where COVID started, it's probably right about here, based on the April was down last year. TRT is still down 9% year to date, but because of those lodging restrictions that are in place, it just didn't rebound quite the way Resort Community did. The fact that Resort Community is up 9% is very encouraging because as you remember that piece of the pie, Resort Community is 4.6 million. It makes up the biggest piece of our pie. Local option is up 7, highways up 8. So here's our overall sales tax year to date for fiscal year 21. So the way we are trending right now is very optimistic. So back to 2020, looking at expenses. So the blue again is budgeted, red is actual spent at the end of the year. So due to administration being very proactive, putting a spending freeze in place, taking some other steps and measures to reduce personnel costs, all to help mitigate the impacts that we were anticipating from COVID, ending the year in a good position with expenses. You can see that generally all of the expenses came in well under budget, and the overall effect that that had for all operational expense categories combined, which includes the enterprise funds, is that you had an operational expense savings of 1.2 million, or a 7% decrease in spending. So that also helps offset the revenue, the operational revenue losses from COVID. And next slide, which got out of order. So when you look at your operational revenue loss, which is the 824 across all of your operational revenue, the savings from expenses, the net effect to your operations is you, across all funds, not just the general fund, you actually ended the year 403,903 ahead, which is really a testament to proactive, responsible fiscal policy on the part of administration to make sure that spending was down, to try and get ahead of the operational revenue losses that honestly, we just didn't know how big they were going to be. So kudos to Joel and staff, everybody that was involved in tightening of belts, making the hard decisions to make sure that the spending freeze was properly implemented and that personnel costs were limited. It was a very tough time, as we all know. So that is the year 2020 in review. Hopefully that helped with a little perspective, since COVID kind of affected 2 years, just to kind of give you an idea of how 2020 ended up. So now
Can we just take one more second to just reiterate what you said, Rachel, because I don't think we could ever say thank you enough to city staff, to Joel's leadership, and to city staff for getting us to the place where we have an easy report to present and to celebrate. So thanks again to staff and to city leadership, and big thanks to Joel for not only getting us through the pandemic, but also taking some pretty big cuts. So thanks, staff.
dark times. Hopefully we won't have dark times like that anytime again soon.
Mike, you just muted. Did you want to share something?
Yeah, I was just going to say for people who are listening on the outside, oftentimes it's popular to think oh, governments can never tighten their belt. They always got a free rein taking our buck. That's not the case. I just want to make that sure. So I want to thank you guys as well for doing what had to be done.
Thanks for sharing that, Mike.
Thank you.
All right, Rachel, let's go deeper with that cute little piggy bank.
Going a little deeper. Get my computer to wake back up, sorry. What is behind the numbers? So recreation, and all the time I've been doing it, recreation is generally proportionally one of the smaller budgets, but one of the more complicated budgets that usually gets the most scrutiny. So generally I like to go a little bit deeper in recreation so that we can all understand what's going on there. Just kind of a little sampling here of everything recreation offers for the community: aquatics, arts, sports. Here is recreation's pie picture. This is their revenue, proposed revenue for next year, an overall budget of 1.5 million. User fees make up 44.3% of that. Grants and donations, 1.2. We do have an interlocal agreement with both the Grand County Special Service Recreation District and the school district, showing their portions at 6.6% and 1%. And then the city picks up the residual amount, which for this next year will be 46.9%, or just over 700,000. How that compares to last year, pretty much the same. There was a slight increase in their budget, which we'll look at on the expense side. And because the interlocal agreements are fixed at a flat rate of 100,000 and 15,000, not a percentage, then that gets absorbed by the city with the general fund subsidy.
I noticed, Rachel, that in the revenue, you're not allocating any RAP funds.
So the RAP funds come into the general fund, and the recreation fund is a special revenue fund, but where those RAP funds would be applied would be this general fund subsidy.
And remind us again what the estimated revenue for RAP tax for this fiscal year.
It was about 315,000, I believe. Let me take a look on my cheat sheet that I have over here that you guys can't see.
Yeah. So, thank you.
Yep,
And
no problem.
the plan going forward, once we start collecting that RAP tax, is to bring an ordinance back to you guys for discussion on how we want to spend that, what type of distribution we want to see, and that will not be just put into the general fund for recreation and spent that way. It's going to be brought to you guys for consideration.
And we discussed having a small community board, advisory board for that as well, correct? Yeah.
And so the amount that's going into that subsidy right now, when we look at it, is basically all coming from your sales-based taxes. So could be TRT, resort community, sales and use tax, highway tax. That's coming out of the bulk of your general fund revenue is sales-based taxes. So how you choose to divide up this piece of the pie is up to you. But with RAP coming in specifically for recreation, arts, and parks, it'd be very easy to say half of this now is coming from the RAP tax. So now as we go into expenses.
Rachel, just quick, those fixed costs that are given to the county that established years ago, and that there's no ability to fluctuate with inflation with that. Is that correct?
Not necessarily. It's an interlocal agreement, and the agreement itself does have a clause in there that it is reviewed annually amongst all of those entities. Like any interlocal agreement, it can be renegotiated at any time. It does have a term, and it has an ability to either terminate or extend it. And it requires city council approval to do any of those things. But it can be renegotiated prior to the end of its term. It did not have a clause in there with an automatic inflationary increase, I guess, if that's the question. So right now for the rec district, for example, it's in there at a flat 100,000. There's another component to the agreement that we'll talk about when we get into debt service. The rec district also pays $190,000 to retire the debt on the aquatic center. But it was a percentage for years, and then it was negotiated to a flat rate. So there is the potential that you could negotiate it back to a percentage again. That would be the pleasure of the council.
And how long was it? No.
To the flat rate? I'm not sure. I'm not certain. I think it was when John Geiger was here. So probably at least more than 10 years ago.
Okay.
Did you ask when the term was up?
No, when it went from a percentage to a flat rate.
Oh, okay. And then, yeah, what's the renegotiation date for that? That's a good question, Karen, by the way.
Joel has a copy of that, or if not, Summer has a copy of it, but I'm not sure what the expiration. It may be one of those ones that is renewed unless it is terminated. But
Yeah.
there's an annual review clause in it.
Yeah, I think it's annually, and then it is retired once the debt is retired on the payment. So it's like in the 2030 range.
There's two interlocal agreements. There's one for the debt, and then there's one for recreation services.
Right. So I'm asking about the recreation services, Carly.
They both, I feel like, have the same timeline. There is one for the debt, and there's one for, we can look into it. They're long. They're like into the 2030 realm to make sure the city was protected. But they do, like, annually we can review it, and the renegotiation would be between all the parties, not just the city.
So this is the overall breakout of expenses. Aquatic, of course, having a larger facility and more staff, having a bigger piece of the pie. And then arts and sports are pretty well matched. They're actually 20.8% and 21.4%. Overall budget, again, is just right over 1.5 million. And then how that compares to last year, pretty on par for last year. Slight increases. Aquatic actually had decreases, but I think there's been kind of a reconfiguration in aquatic with staffing or with programming. So that's probably what the slight decrease in aquatic is attributed to. And then with sports and arts, some slight increases, part of that in increase in part due to some of the personnel costs that came back for this year. I'm just going to keep going through unless if you guys have questions, just interrupt me.
Thank you.
That's it for recreation. Now to talk about revenue sources. I'll let you soak in all of the graphics there for a minute. I had so much fun picking them out. So when we talk about revenue sources, we operate the enterprise funds as businesses because we're offering a service to the customers. And then there are the services that we offer that we don't have a direct recapture from our customers that we rely on taxes for. First, I want to talk about utility rates. And I think this has been a topic that's come up more lately. I know throughout the years, we've talked quite a bit about utility rates. When it came to the forefront, prior to this council and this mayor, when the early stages of the water reclamation facility, when we went through our rate structure and identified that it was too low to support the debt that we wanted to take on for the new treatment plant, and what that would look like long-term to put those rate increases in, along with the water studies that we've done, showing that we've had some of the lowest water rates in the state. So none of this is new. We've talked about it before, but in the context of next year's budget, we need to dig a little deeper into it. For this year's budget, fiscal year 2021, the issue is the sewer rates we currently have won't generate enough income to cover both operations and debt payments. Now, you may ask, or citizens may ask, how is that possible? How would we put together a budget that doesn't cover operations and debt payments? The short answer, which isn't a simple answer, it's kind of complicated, is that previously we have relied on impact fees to make those debt payments. And historically, we have collected enough in sewer. Our sewer impact fee is quite a bit higher than our water impact fee because our sewer infrastructure costs more. And when we did the impact fee study, they came back with plenty of data to show that we needed to collect a higher impact fee on sewer to be able to do both treatment and collection. The majority of those impact fees have come from commercial development and specifically from overnight accommodations. So when this year's budget was put together, we budgeted impact fees at the same level that we would have collected them in 2020. The political climate over this last year and decisions that have been made to eliminate new overnight accommodations has had a significant outcome in the revenue that we are bringing in impact fees. So for this year, we're not collecting enough impact fees to make that debt payment. It was not anticipated when this budget was put together that that would be a decision that was made this year. And so where that's left us is the revenue from operations that we'll be generating this year based on what we budgeted is $493,000. Our debt payments for both the water reclamation facility and the sewer loan that was taken out for the North Area Trunk Sewer that was approved by council a couple of years ago, that combined debt payment is just under $1 million, which leaves us with a deficit in the sewer fund of $478,644, which for this year we're looking at if we can take that out of our existing fund balance. That's this year that we're currently in. When we look at next year with our current sewer rate structure that's in place, we have the same problem. Impact fees aren't changing. The impact fee itself doesn't go up just because we have limited the type of construction or the type of commercial development that can take place in the city. The impact fee stays the same. It's just that we're not generating that type of development that we can assess the impact fee to. The revenue from operations for next year goes down by a couple $100,000, which is in part due to the fact that we recalculated the overhead payment that the enterprise fund makes to the general fund. We didn't do that last year because of trying to cut the 1.5 million from the budget pre-COVID. Then we had COVID. We decided we would leave the overhead payment alone. This year, it had been 2 or 3 years since we had gone in and put in the actual numbers for the overhead payment. If we haven't talked about the overhead payment before, the enterprise fund relies on general fund services in order to conduct their business as an enterprise fund, including administrative costs like management, accounting services, HR services, accounts receivable services. That's the majority of what the treasurer's office does. Utilities for their buildings, all of the things that you would have to pay as a business owner to keep your business running. So we actually go through and calculate those costs, and then it's almost like we send a bill to the enterprise funds to say, this is how much the services cost. They pay that money into the general fund. It comes in as general fund revenue. So there was an increase to that this year, which is why the revenue from operations decreased in the sewer fund. Debt payment stays about the same. Deficit for next year goes up to 665,696. So without those impact fees, we're left with a deficit, basically unable to make our debt payment. Can we take it from one-time reserves? Yes, those reserves are running out. It's not sustainable to, as you know, from your personal finances, when you're making a debt payment out of savings, you can only do that for so long before you deplete your savings, and the purpose that you've set your savings aside for is not well served by that. So that leaves us in the position of, we know that we need sewer rate increases. We've talked about that every year, but the necessity is a lot more urgent now because we're not generating enough to make our debt payment. And the steepness of the percentage that we need to increase also just changed dramatically. The capital projects and equipment purchases that we would have liked to have done for this year have been stripped out because until we can make those debt payments, we can't contemplate anything else in the sewer fund. The current loan that we have on the water reclamation facility with the Division of Water Quality requires that we keep a debt coverage ratio of 1.25%. What that means is we have to generate enough income in the sewer fund to not only pay our debt payment, but to pay 1.25% of our debt payment. So basically to have 0.25 of our debt payment that we could set aside as an emergency fund or set aside for other purposes. We cannot take on I apologize. We cannot take on any new debt until our existing debt is covered at a ratio of 1.25%. That is in the bond document that the city agreed to when we took out the loan on the WRF. In addition to that, equipment purchases, small capital projects, those are just completely off the table, obviously, until we can cover that debt payment. So to achieve the 1.25%, what would that take if we said, okay, great, next year we want to get to that 1.25%, you'd be looking at a user rate increase in the sewer fund of 75%. That's not really a manageable user rate increase to try and accommodate in 1 year, but to kind of put in perspective for you the shape that we're in the sewer fund, that's where we're at. Anticipating the effect that losing those impact fees would have, I'm not sure if that's a conversation that would have changed the outcome or not, but it's definitely a consequence of we're definitely feeling the consequence of that now because of those impact fees and the effect that it's having specifically on the sewer fund, because the sewer impact fees represents the overnight accommodation portion of sewer impact fees represents such a big portion of what we were bringing in. So let's go on to water. The good news for water is they are in slightly better shape. Fiscal year 22 water rates will generate enough income to cover operations and debt payments. However, not a whole lot is left over for capital and equipment. Again, as we know, we have some of the lowest water rates in the state. Revenue from operations for next year is anticipated to be $585,483. This debt payment that I have in there, I put it to reflect the $7 million bond that you just had the public hearing on. Because looking at the bond documents from Alex, that first payment would be due next fiscal year. So assuming that you move forward with that, and the payment on that, so the payment in the water fund right now, I believe is around $40,000 on your existing debt. So the payment on that new bond is about $440,000 a year. So that's going to leave $103,000 for all of your capital projects, all of your equipment, any new payments on any new debt. Now, obviously, rates will change. It's not like you would keep rates at the 2022 level, but you can see in order to take on new debt or tackle any substantial capital projects, the water fund is going to need some significant rate increases, or at least some sustained significant rate increases in the short term, and then sustained rate increases over the long term, which we've talked about for both funds. Sustained rate increases are really the only way to keep the funds healthy and to keep up on infrastructure. And unfortunately, that's not the philosophy the city's used in the past for about the past 20, 30 years, which is in part how we got to this point today. And this kind of covers everything that I just talked about. Debt coverage, again, it's a good idea to keep it at 1.25%. Also, if we want to go into new debt over and above that $7 million bond, that's what lenders are going to look for. Future water projects, major water projects are going to rely on that bonding, so our rates must support operations and future debt capacity. Sorry, that was like the downer part of the budget presentation. Assuming the rest of the budget presentation is like an upper.
Say, Rachel, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Impact fees and the absence of them with the absence of new hotels. Aren't impact fees scheduled to kind of pay off in the next 6 years? Isn't there something in the impact fee statute about that? And I mean, to what extent are, I guess what I'm worried about is, yeah, we could do new hotels and that would help with immediate impact fees and so forth, but then that would just generate a longer term increase in cost to supply those services.
So impact fees, you're correct, Mike. By statute, you have 6 years from the time that you collect them to spend them. And that's the state legislature's way of ensuring that you're not collecting an impact fee that isn't based on a real need. With our sewer impact fees, we've never had a problem spending them, probably because we're always kind of running in the deficit with offering sewer services until we got the WRF online. Our old treatment plant, as you know, was failing. So we've never had an issue spending our sewer impact fees. When they changed the impact fee code 5, 10, 15 years ago, saying that we could use all of the impact fees that we collect to retire debt. So specifically on the WRF, anything that we collect as an impact fee, whether it's residential or from GWISA or from the San Juan Improvement District, all of those impact fees go directly to our debt payment. That's really the only thing that we're using impact fees for, because right now we're not collecting enough impact fees to hit the threshold of our debt payment. So I feel confident in saying any sewer impact fee that you collect, you will not have a hard time spending in 6 years. You will put it directly towards your debt on the water reclamation facility. Water is a little bit different, but once you do that water tank project, that's going to help you spend your water impact fees.
Okie dokie. Well, yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess this is another political issue, as you mentioned earlier on. We have a lot of residents, of course, who may well object to a lot of new hotels mushrooming around town and impacting their quality of life. And you could argue that's true. The upside is that those developments do help pay for services and so forth. So that's a political choice that all of us are going to have to make. And I'm happy to keep that question open.
I agree. And it's a very tricky political question, one that, our community struggled with, previous councils have struggled with. When it comes to the fiscal side, the accounting side, where that burden is going to fall, if it's going to fall on commercial development or tourism, or if it's going to fall on permanent year-round residents, that's a very tricky balance. And so once we start moving the scales around, things like you just saw in the sewer fund are going to be thrown out of balance. So it's tricky for sure.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we've talked about utility rates, let's talk about tax options. As you know, we don't have control over sales tax. And we kind of had a bit of I won't say a panic, but a bit of a wake-up call when the state legislature 2 years ago went through their sales tax reform, and we lobbied through the league very proactively to make sure that resort communities were held harmless, which thank goodness happened. So, but we don't set the rates for any of the sales taxes, the boutique taxes that we collect. So the city council at one of the previous meetings requested an analysis of what would happen if Moab City implemented a property tax. What would that look like for the average homeowner? Going into this, just because we just looked at utility funds and the utility rates look a little dismal, I just want to put a disclaimer out there. Property tax cannot be used for enterprise funds. Since enterprise funds are operated as a business, property taxes are for government operations, not for enterprise funds. So all of the scenarios you're about to see are based on a primary residence with an assessed value of 300,000. Since it is a primary residence, only 55% of the value is assessed for taxable purposes. Option 1, which would raise $1 million in revenue for the city, the annual tax based on that $300,000 home primary resident would be $198.33 per year. I won't go through the cost per day and the tax rate on each of these options, but some council members wanted to know specifically what the tax rate was, other wanted to know what the annual tax rate. Well, we broke it down in a cost per day so that you could kind of put that into perspective as well. Option 2 would raise $1.25 million. It would be $247.83 per year. So as you can see, we just went up in $250,000 increments. 1.5 would be just under $300 a year. Option 4, 1.75 million would be $347 per year. And we stopped at 2 million. Option 5 would raise 2 million per year, an annual tax of just under $400. The way it works with truth in taxation and levying a property tax through the state tax commission, it's basically the city determines what the revenue need is and submits that to both the state and to the county treasurer. So for example, if the city said we have a revenue need of $2 million, then that's submitted. And then based on what the city's valuation is for both residential and commercial, primary residence, secondary residence, and commercial, they come back and say, okay, that would put your tax rate at 0.002403. That would raise $2 million for the city. Then you would go through a truth and taxation hearing.
I'm noticing that we didn't do any options that were less than a projected income of $1 million. So, I mean, just doing the math, we could option, I don't know, 0.5 could be half a million at $100 for a home valued at 300,000. I just wonder if, if that's more, a more graduated approach might be, it's just an option for us to consider. And then the analysis that I was interested in looking at too, or just to, build on this analysis is, I know that annexation can, if tied to the implementation of a property tax, would increase both revenues as well as expenses, but might be worth consideration as part of an analysis if we were to look at certain areas for annexation. Joel, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, obviously without a property tax, annexation's not beneficial at all because it's just all expense. Once you adopt a property tax, annexation can be not necessarily a moneymaker, but if you get commercial properties in the mix with housing, there can be a benefit to it for sake of regulation and also for the revenue as well. But without it, annexation has pretty much no use in reality.
And then gives us the opportunity to provide more people in the valley services, city services. And I've also said too, like if people start saying, well, what's in it for me? That we can look at certain perks, if you will, for, if we were to look at a property tax implementation plan, we could look at certain perks like a city resident reduced fee for the MRAC or for the MARC, things like that. As
Well,
well
and so,
police
it's, requ-
services and the ability to vote in a city election.
it's required by state law anytime we do an annexation that we provide a tax breakdown for the current situation of a property and then what it would look like under the city. We haven't done that analysis, obviously, because we haven't been asked to, but at times that tax structure can be not, it doesn't necessarily have to be an increase if you're offsetting some taxes that will no longer be charged because they're coming into a municipality. And I know that in this case, there's not an unincorporated tax in Grand County, but in some counties there are. That unincorporated tax falls off, and they pick up the city tax. So at times it can actually be the same or very negligible as what the tax structure actually is. And then the service that's provided is then different. So we'd have to do that tax analysis to determine what the actual impact would be. It can increase, it can be the same. It just kind of depends on what the current tax status of the parcels that you're annexing are.
Sounds like a pretty fun project for a new, fresh set of eyes. Looking down at the city finances from 6+ feet, if you will.
If somebody likes spreadsheets, it's the best job on the planet.
Does Ben like spreadsheets?
I don't know yet, but it's spreadsheet heaven when you do annexations. You have every parcel, all the values, everything. You're just literally just building spreadsheet after spreadsheet to determine what values and what your increases are and everything else. So it's a lot of data. It's a ton of data when you do an annexation.
But I do think that the additional option could be even less, starting off less than projected revenue of $1 million, but we could look at least $500,000, at least something, especially when we look at this pandemic and what very little sales tax for a couple of months. If the pandemic would have been different, if we would have been in a really difficult space, because, like if oil were to go away all of a sudden, I mean, what we saw as a municipality was a wake-up call that being completely dependent on sales tax is very scary for us. And understanding, what it would take to run the city bare minimum too, should be perhaps the strategy of what we hope to raise or have in terms of revenue in this exercise.
And something I want to point out with this analysis is the real benefit to not having a property tax is second homeowners. These rates that you're looking at are assessed off of the county assessor's value of a parcel. If that parcel is a primary residence, and there's a 55% reduction, or excuse me, a 45% reduction in the amount that's actually taxed, and then 55% of that is levied. And so if someone has a second home, that value is assessed at the 100%. If someone's having a second home in Moab City, they're only coming here once a year. They're not paying any property taxes. And in that once a year visit or once a month, one month a year visit, they're not spending enough in sale tax to justify the amount of services they're using. It's really the second homeowner who's getting the free ride in the no property tax scheme. The resident who lives here full time is still shopping here. They're still buying here. They're still paying that sales tax, which anyone in any other city is as well on top of their property tax. But someone who lives here as a full-time resident is still paying some sales tax. Someone who's living here part-time as a second home, who's paying no property tax, using services year-round that the city provides, and not living here enough to really garnish any sales tax from their visit, that's who's getting the free ride out of the no property tax.
Hey, Rachel, quick question for you. The proposed rates, mill rates that you've thrown out there, 0.001 to 0.002 roughly, how do those compare to the existing rates that are already assessed by the county and the school district and all that? In other words, can we feasibly make the argument that the new taxes here are small compared to what they're already paying, or is that not true?
It is a lower rate, definitely lower than the school district. I can pull up a tax notice. We have to pull up like an individual properties tax notice, but I don't have a direct comparison ready for you tonight.
So okay. I did that this afternoon, and it's at that 1 point, what was the mill levy? 1.8. That would be a 10% increase to a property tax bill.
Thank you. That helps. You're going to be all right, Ben.
The other thing I was just going to mention is keep in mind that commercial property is assessed at 100% of value in addition to secondary residences. And then these are just some actual properties that we pulled just to show you. And the 55% reduction is actually just on the building. Land is still assessed at 100%. Just to kind of show you what the tax bill would be under the different scenarios.
I'm sorry, Rachel. Did you say that the building and the land is at 100%?
The land is at 100%, the building is at 55%.
Gotcha. And then Ben, you use that mill levy percentage off of that option 3, is that correct?
Off of the, yeah, that's correct, from the previous slide. Oh yeah, on this slide as well, yeah.
Sorry, I'm jumping around.
The current rate for Grant County is 0.002133.
The thing to remember with that is that's Grand County. You also have the school districts, which also carry a big burden of the property tax as well.
They carry the vast
library, and there's a few others. I think there were 11 lines in total for a typical household in Grand County, or sorry, in Moab City.
Right, because we also have our special service districts. So the thing that, you know, while Grand County is the entity that collects the money, it's distributed over, you know, to several entities. And so we would just be saying, well, the city might be a new line item addition to that large already existing tax bill that people pay. And we'll have to do a really important education efforts around this.
Has anybody on staff looked at how many second home evaluations are done for the city? Is that?
I did, Karen, about 3 or 4 years ago. I don't have the data anymore, but I know that the county assessor pulled for me a list and showed the valuation by primary residence and the valuation by secondary. And I won't try and remember the number, but I was surprised. I was surprised by how many second homes were within city limits.
Really?
That's data we'd want to update, because even if I did have it, it would be, that was in either 2015 or 2016 that I had the county assessor pull it. I always had the perception that most of the second homes were in the county. And I was surprised at how many were in the city. But that's definitely data that we can get.
Great.
You all just tell me when you're ready, and this is the last property tax slide. So after this, it's a new topic. Okay. We're nearing the end. So that is it for revenue. And just to touch briefly on staff paying benefits, year of COVID, we have our heart there. So the budget does include a 1.8 proposed cost of living adjustment. It also includes reinstituting both longevity pay and merit increases. It has the addition of a full-time position of safety specialist. It says full-time position, however, for this last year, it was funded at a half-time position. An employee in another department was actually performing the duties as a half-time position. So it's really the increase of a half-time position. A part-time position for animal control officer. Those are the only 2 positions that would technically be an FTE increase over the previous year. Currently, there are 77 full-time employees. There are 84 full-time positions. The math there works out that there are 7 open positions that we're currently hiring for, 45 part-time employees. That's actually a pretty drastic reduction over the last time I did this presentation. Mostly, I think recreation has had some reductions in their part-time employees. 218 individuals are receiving health benefits. That includes spouses and dependents, but that's obviously a significant impact to the community health insurance that we're providing for community members. 77 employees on our retirement plan, and 60 employees participate in our wellness program. This is year 4 or 5 of our wellness program, and I think we've had some HR would speak to that. Keep forgetting I'm a part-time employee. HR would speak to that, but we've had some pretty good outcomes and results from our wellness program. That has been funded in some of the cost savings from our health insurance being self-funded, and also our health reimbursement arrangement savings. Debt. We've already looked at fund balances, how we have paid for capital projects in the last 20 years with surpluses in the general fund, mainly from sales tax. We took a look at utility rates for water and sewer, storm drain. Major capital project we had in storm drain this last year was the cost share with UDOT, $2 million for the Stewart Canyon storm drain issue that the 191 widening project is resolving for us. But with the enterprise funds, user rates are the mechanism that we use to pay for capital projects. Our general fund surpluses seem to have reached an end. How are we going to pay for projects and equipment moving forward? This is a continuation of a conversation we've had in previous years. Same graph again, looking at how we've paid for them in the past. Here's our debt history, showing that previously we've had a fairly modest debt load. Once we started taking on some new debt, mainly the Aquatic Center in 2010, and from there you can see the step ups that we've taken for the water reclamation facility. That debt came online in 2019. The USU Road, affordable housing, which was the Walnut Lane land acquisition, and then the development costs. And then this includes the $7 million bond that is proposed right now for the water department. And then just a footnote, the housing debt, the facility debt for city center and recreation, which would be the aquatic center, and the USU road debt. City center, recreation, USU, all of those are CIB loans. Those are secured with sales tax revenue. The affordable housing loans through Zions Bank are also secured with sales tax revenue. With the recreation loan, that is mostly paid by the special service district, all but $1,000, strangely. And the USU road debt is a cost share with the county. They help pay a portion of that debt. But the thing I just want to emphasize here is that our sales tax is what secures it. So if you wanted to go out and take on additional debt with your sales tax funds, all of these bonds, all of these loans that you have in place are already counting against that revenue. One of the components that you miss out on as a municipality is something called a GOB, a general obligation bond.
Yeah, forgive me, Rachel. It's stupid 101 sort of question. When you say these bonds are secured by sales tax revenue, do you mean the interest payments on them are paid out of sales tax revenue, or do you mean they're just simply guaranteed if a funding source fails somewhere else?
It's the guarantee in essence. So when a prospective lender comes and looks at the city's finance, they're going to look at the total amount of debt payments that you have that are secured by sales tax and the total amount of revenue that you're bringing in from sales tax. Even if you're not making those payments with the sales tax revenue, they're still going to count it against your sales tax revenue. Okay. So they'll say, here's how much debt capacity you have left based on the debt payments that you have. So the recreation loan, for example, is $191,000 a year. We get $190,000 from the rec district through an interlocal agreement, but CIB CIB doesn't recognize that agreement as security. So our sales tax is what secures that, because they're, in their mind, the recreation district at any time could come and back out and say, you know what, we're not going to pay that 190, which if you're listening, recreation district, you can't do. We're not going to do that. But as far as CIB is concerned, they want a safeguard, and that's our sales tax.
Got it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So that extends out through 2040, so that you can see our debt load, which with the 2 new bonds that are proposed would be over 33.5 million. What that current debt load looks like, everything that's in blue is a facility loan. Red is infrastructure. Yellow is affordable housing. And then just to talk about capital improvements. So we've talked about different revenue sources, our utility rates, property tax, what our current debt looks like. I didn't want to leave out of the conversation what future or existing capital improvements and projects are that we're not addressing in this budget. We've talked about the state that our infrastructure is in, what we need to do to catch up. And I just wanted to briefly look at the capital improvement project list that council adopted about this time last year, March of 2020, that has the prioritized list that staff went through the rating and ranking process of all of the capital projects citywide. Some of these projects have changed. That's why this list generally will be updated every year. With the year of COVID, it didn't get updated this year because things were kind of put on hold. But most of these projects still stand as priorities and will require future funding, either through future indebtedness, cost share agreements, federal funding opportunities, you know, other local government, whether it's the county or UDOT or other state agencies. So when you look at bottom line numbers here, you can see our need isn't diminishing, which is why we want to make sure that our revenue is keeping pace with the needs that we have for infrastructure replacement and maintenance.
We do have the CIP that's on the April 27th meeting, and we have meetings set to go back through it. There shouldn't be a lot of changes, but we did that March of last year, and it should be coming back to you here in the next couple of weeks.
And then last is just the timeline and process for the budget. Where does it go from here? During the month of March, staff met with the city manager and the HR director to assemble their budgets, put their requests together, and then city manager and HR director sat down and balanced the budget to get to the point we're at tonight, to have a balanced budget to present to council on April 1st. Then the city council generally has weekly workshops in April to get into the level of detail that you feel comfortable with, so that you understand the aspects of the budget to move forward to the public hearing, accepting public input in April and May. Previously, we had the online interactive budgeting tool that we posted for the public.
Uh-oh, Rachel, we just lost you. Rachel, I can't hear you nor see you. Okay. We just lost you for a minute there, Rachel.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I freeze up?
You did.
Am I back?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Yeah. After I froze up, then it told me my internet was unstable. Sorry. So public hearing in May.
Well, we are at 7:33, so we might all be feeling like your internet. And I do think that we were trying to hit an hour and a half of this meeting anyway. Okay. So 2
slides left.
Okay.
So you would adopt the budget in June. We would also have the budget opening for this current fiscal year in June. And then staff implementation throughout the year. And then the council's role is just working with the city manager to make sure the goals and priorities are updated and reviewed for budget amendments and for the budget development. And there you go, hour and a half, because we did start 5 minutes late after your declaration.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel, for the presentation. I don't know why I'm getting feedback. All of us were kind of getting feedback. Thank you for the presentation. Definitely, you know, we've all gone through the budget process now several times. And it was helpful to receive the big spreadsheet in advance of this meeting. So thank you and Danny for sending that out. I know that, you know, I've got some questions, but I'm glad that you ended the slideshow with a timeline, because it feels like we need to organize our questions and get them answered during that process. So I guess I want to can you unshare your screen so I can just see everybody's faces? I just want to see if anybody's feeling, here, let me change my view, sorry. If anyone's leaning in and getting super anxious to make any comments tonight, or if we are okay for me to accept a motion to adjourn, knowing that we've got a lot to talk about, and we could certainly talk for another 30 minutes tonight, but I really would like to place our questions, you know, in the right place, which seems to be during the budget process. So council, I just want to look at all of you. Do you agree? Are we all on the same page? Does anyone have any burning questions or comments at the conclusion of this presentation right now? Other than a thank you to Rachel and staff. Yay, thank you to Rachel and staff. Yay, thumbs up. Oh, Karen's thumb is like permanently up, it looks like, with that one. Aw. All right, so Joel, staff, do you have any other comments or questions at this time?
I don't, just look forward to getting your feedback, and just want to reiterate that ultimately you guys, it's your budget and you have to approve it. So look forward to getting your feedback and making changes as you guys see fit, and prioritizing things where they need to be prioritized. So
Awesome. Thank you. Is there a motion to adjourn?
I so move.
Thank you, Mike. Karen, I saw you wave. I'll take that as a second. Discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, then we are adjourned. Thank you all for zooming in tonight. We'll